name is Tracy Webster. I'm going to be chairing this session. The format is that we're going to have 6 presentations that will take us through to lunch. And first up, we have Sive Kolisi, please take the stage, who's going to be speaking on origins and invasion date of quilted millennia. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not the Kolisi you guys were expecting. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sive Kolisi, and I'll be taking you through the work that I did for my master's, where I was looking at the origins and invasion depth of Teribia granifera in southern Africa. So Teribia granifera is a major benthic invader which dominates the benthos. It comes from Southeast Asia, and it constantly expands its range in both freshwater and brackish habitats. It reproduces parthenogenetically, which increases its invasion ability. It can reach densities of up to 5,000 individuals per square meter, as you can see on the picture down on your right, on my left. So the major contributors are habitat modification and bird dispersal. So Teribia was first recorded in South Africa in 1999 in a reservoir in Mandini, KwaZulu-Natal. This reservoir supplies water to a paper mill. So it was introduced in the country with discarded contents of a tropical fish tank. Currently, 26 years after its introduction in South Africa, Teribia occupies 3 provinces, which are KwaZulu-Natal, Limpopo, and Mpumalanga. So looking at this wide distribution, we aimed to investigate the distribution and potential expansion of Teribia populations in South Africa using species distribution models. So we hypothesized that there will be a southward spread which will be influenced by water temperature. Secondly, we wanted to assess the genetic diversity and trace the source of introduction. And we also now hypothesize that Teribia granifera was introduced in the country through in the region through multiple invasion events. To do this, we initially looked at bioclim variables. However, they have been used as proxies in freshwater studies. But for us, these were irrelevant because Teribia granifera is a benthic species. So using bioclim variables would have no biological relevance. Doing that, we now collected in situ water quality data, and we collected these from published research and unpublished data from researchers and research institutions. Now, this metadata that we collected was converted into shapefiles using ArcMap. The shapefiles were then converted into environmental raster layers using the IDW spatial analyst. So what this does is it interpolates a raster surface from points using an inverse distance weighted technique. So all our spatial analysis were carried out using the packages raster, map tools, and biomod2. And then we implemented these in the R programming language. So we based all our models in an ensemble approach, and we implemented them in Maxent, GLM, BRT, Mars, and Random Forest. All our models used occurrence data from the introduced range, which is South Africa. And we followed the methods of Mariatis and colleagues. So for our DNA, we extracted our DNA using the salting out method, and we targeted and sequenced the CO1 gene. To determine the phylogenetic relativeness, we constructed the Bayesian inference, and to infer the haplotype relationships, we constructed a TCS network using pop art. So on the map that you see is a predicted suitability map. So it shows a northward inland expansion and a southward coastal expansion. These are influenced by temperature that range from 16 degrees to 30 degrees and an optimal temperature of 25 degrees. And then turbidity also has an influence. However, it ranges from 0 to 50 NTU. And also the phosphate concentrations also have an influence on the spread of Teribia. It goes from 5 to 15 milligrams per liter. Lastly, electric conductivity, which goes from 0 to 2,000. Yes. Moving on. So what you see there is a phylogenetic tree and a haplotype network. However, both of these figures represent the same thing. So I'll focus on the haplotype network, and I've highlighted in red what I'm gonna be speaking about. In South Africa, so this is a portion of an ongoing work where we are looking at the source of introduction of Teribia. So in South Africa, we believe that, so the genetics are telling us that KwaZulu-Natal is the common ancestor for the southern population, for the southern Africa population. And we believe that the snails further spread into the region through secondary dispersal by migratory birds. As you can see there, I have color-coded the regions, the provinces, and countries. So we have inferred that Thailand is the source population because it has clustered together with the southern African sequences. And then the lines that you see are mutational differences. So the S14 represents a sample from Zimbabwe, and then the NO04 represents a sample from Mpumalanga, and the NSE represents a sample from KZN. So this tells us that there's actually a single population that exists in Southern Africa. However, the three that are standing out are species that have mutated. But as you can see, they have single lines, so that means there's a single mutational difference. So the take-home message is that Teribia granifera is spreading southward on the coastal plain towards the Eastern Cape and northward inland. So potentially, we can predict that the water quality variables that I showed earlier on are the ones that are influencing both the spreads. And we know that Teribia granifera was introduced to Southern Africa by a single invasion event that spread from KwaZulu-Natal, as I showed you on the haplotype network. So the knowledge from this study can help us understand the invasion dynamics of freshwater snail invaders. I'd like to acknowledge these institutions and the people that helped me with my project. Thank you.
Thanks, Sive. Do we have any questions in the audience? No. Thank you. Next up, we have Stefan Woodburn with a very interesting topic. How doth the little crocodile?
How doth the little crocodile improve his shining tail and pour the waters of the Nile on every golden scale? The first stanza of Lewis Carroll's poem, The Crocodile, it invokes a kind of pleasant feeling about the little crocodile, maybe something that looks like this. In reality, this poem is about the mischief of human children. And when we get on to the second stanza, it looks more like this. How cheerfully he seems to grin, how neatly spreads his claws, and welcomes little fishes in with gently smiling jaws. And perhaps the image associated with the second stanza is more like this, a mischievous little crocodile. Now, whether you subscribe to the innocent crocodile or the mischievous crocodile, the little crocodile that invites fish in has the risk of a completely different image, and that image is tragedy. This is a crocodile from the Olifants River Gorge from 2010. This was a period when crocodiles were dying from a disease called pansteatitis. Now, pansteatitis is a dietary disease, so it had something to do with whatever the crocodiles were eating. The crocodiles were dying in a very limited range. It's called the Olifants River Gorge. It's from where the Letaba River, the confluence between the Letaba and Olifants River, down to Masingia Dam in Mozambique. And there was a hint of what was going on here, and it came from catfish. Catfish in the same area had the same disease. And it turned out that catfish that had fish in their stomachs had pansteatitis. Catfish that had no fish in their stomachs didn't have pansteatitis. So we thought it was something to do with a fish diet. Now, I do stable isotope work, and we can try and reconstruct the way in which trophic relations organize in a food web. And so what we didn't imagine that this was eating any fish. It was maybe there's a specific fish species that was the cause of this. And maybe the catfish were eating these fish and the crocodiles were eating this fish, and they both got the disease. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of stable isotope analysis, but we measure the isotopes of carbon on the x-axis, nitrogen on the y-axis, and it's the nitrogen that separates trophic levels. So we would have expected crocodiles that are eating fish to plot higher than the fish. What we actually have here are the red crosses are the crocodile measurements, and the blue crosses are the fish. And so what we have to conclude is that the fish were eating crocodiles. This is absurd. To unravel this required a whole lot of scientific work. It's a glorious program to work out these kinds of dilemmas. The first thing we had to do was try and understand the biochemistry of isotopes in fish. Then we had to understand the biochemistry of isotopes in crocodiles. And then we realized something that perhaps we ought to have realized earlier on. We were doing a study after the pansteatitis epidemic had ended. Was there a possibility that we are not seeing the cause of the pansteatitis epidemic because it's no longer there? So we had to come up with a way to try and go back in time, and we figured that the claws of the crocodiles was the answer. Now, the claws of a crocodile, we presumed, grew the way your fingernails grew. So the tip of your fingernail grew a lot longer back in time than the base of your fingernail. So we thought that by measuring along the length of a crocodile claw, we would be able to work out what their diet has been in the past, hoping we would see what was happening at the time of the pansteatitis epidemic. And what you can see is our nitrogen isotope profile along the length of the claw. And it's quite interesting, because by far the majority of the nitrogen isotopes that we measure indicate a terrestrial diet, not fish. But we picked up these spikes, and those spikes are absolutely consistent with the crocodiles eating fish. So what this told us is that crocodiles generally are not eating fish, but they do sometimes. And this evidence seemed to suggest that it was episodic. Now, we've solved the problem in some ways because now we can say, yes, the crocodiles were eating fish. But we always, the scientists, have to go a little bit further. And we wanted to know if this is episodic, how episodic is episodic? And so we wanted to try and work out what kind of time range is reflected in the record that we're getting from these claws. So we sectioned a claw from top to bottom, and what you can see in the bottom right of that image is the section through the claw, and through a little bit of chemical magic in the lab, we were able to etch the edge of that claw, and you can see little laminations. I don't know if you can make that out in the bottom right, but there are little layers in the claw, and those laminations, we actually went and dissected them out one at a time and did radiocarbon dating on it, and we could prove that these are annual growth rings, like the growth rings in a tree. And on the basis of that, we could change our time axis from sample number to years. So it turns out that these nitrogen excursions indicating fish consumption were annual events. Just because we always take things too far, we wanted to see if the same thing happens outside of Kruger National Park, where there was no pancytitis epidemic, and sure, we found that the crocodiles outside of the park are also not really eating fish, maybe episodically. So now we know that the crocodiles were eating fish occasionally. Why is it that it happened in this one location? And to understand this, we have to look at the geography. At the time that the pancytitis outbreak happened, Massingier Dam wall had been raised to provide more irrigation water. It had backflooded up into the Olifants River Gorge. And just to illustrate the difference between a backflooded Olifants River Gorge and what it used to be, this is what the Olifants Gorge looks like when water levels are low, if Lake Massingier is low. When it's high, this is the same view. This is what it looks like. And the difference between those two images is quite profound, especially if you're a little crocodile, because crocodiles like beaches to lie on, and with the backflooding of the gorge, there was no place for them to lie on the beach. The second thing that's important about this is that gorge is something like 9 kilometers long. As soon as it stops being a river and it rises, anything that flows in does not flow through very quickly. So you have a higher residence time of the water in the system when it's flooded. And this is where we're trying to narrow why did this happen in this particular location and not elsewhere. And it's got to do with the pollution that we are putting down the Olifants River. I've spoken about that previously at these meetings. That pollution leads to annual toxic algal blooms. Now, this is not synthetic color. This is real. That's what it looks like if you get close to it. And it's extensive. This is a huge body of water that looks like some kind of luminescent green paint. This algae is toxic, and the filter-feeding fish love it. So the tilapia, the Oreochromis mozambicus, they migrate into this system, concentrates the fish in this area. They're busy eating the algae, and then the crocodile, they just think, well, this is too easy. So many fish in a small area, they eat the fish. So we think that what was happening is that when these algal blooms happen, it concentrated the fish, the crocodiles were binge feeding on the fish. Now, there's a bit of a problem with this theory because we know that we think it's fish. We think we know why it's happening in a particular area, but there's two little problems. The one is these toxic algal blooms are happening every year. They are so bad that we can track them from satellites now. Why didn't it happen again? We didn't have another pancytitis outbreak. The second thing is, we should have looked closely at those crocodile claws, because what that was telling us is that crocodile had binged on fish for several years in its life, and it didn't die of pancytitis until the very end. So just eating these fish during an algal bloom is not sufficient criteria. Now, the great thing around doing this kind of research, you go out there, you don't know what's going on at all. And we would sit around the fire late at night after catching crocodiles, and we would speculate what was going on. And the Sandparks team was actually the team that said, it's not just eating fish. It's got to do with the metabolism of crocodiles. If they get cold after eating fish, the fish that is in their stomach will stay there. And it will rot, like any fish will rot, and perhaps worse in a crocodile's stomach if you've ever been there. And so Sandparks actually came up with the idea, let's try and understand the thermal ecology of the crocodiles as well, and see if this ties into the pansteatitis outbreak. And so it was Sandparks' initiative, let's put some tracking devices and temperature sensors onto some crocodiles. And so how do you do this? Well, the first thing that you must do is ask the crocodile to just get out the river. Then it must lie still, and we would anesthetize the nuchal scoot that's on the back of the neck. And we would mount a tracking device. You can see it as a little green thing. We would mount that onto the back of the neck of the crocodile. That tracking device has a GPS position indicator. It logged temperature, and it also had an accelerometer in it, so it would log whether the crocodiles are being active. In addition, we would ask some of the crocodiles if they would open their mouth and gently bite onto this felt-coated metal tube, because when they did that, we could look down that tube and get to their gular flap, open up the back of their throat, take a creepy-crawly tube, push it down into the stomach of the crocodile, and drop a thermal sensor into there. Interesting sound, as it goes into the... Obviously, when you ask a crocodile to bite on the felt, you really don't want to give it the chance to change its mind, so we would tape its mouth closed, as you can see. But this meant that we had temperature sensors from the stomach of the crocodile as well. Waiting for a slide to update. There we go. Okay, and so here's the data that we got. At the top, you can see a Google Earth image. On the right, you've got Lake Massingier. The yellow line is the border between Mozambique and South Africa. And you can see the red dots are where we got fixes on the crocodiles. And you can see they moved up the Letaba, the northwest up the Letaba. They didn't really go far southwest along the Olifants. But there was definitely a concentration of the crocodiles between the confluence of the Letaba and the Olifants and Massingier Dam. At the bottom, you can see the thermal data that we got. In black is the temperature that we got from the back of their necks. In red is the data that we got from the stomachs. Now, I don't know how crocodiles do it, but they are able to get rid of thermal... Actually, I know how they do it, but they get rid of the thermal sensors in their stomach. So we didn't get as much thermal data from the stomachs as we would have liked. The blue data set is the air temperature, and the orange is what we got out of the accelerometer. So you see, we've got about 4 years of data, not all of it for internal temperature. And so the question is, what does this mean? Now, I imagined that that sensor on the back of the head of the crocodile would be telling us about air temperature. If it was air temperature, then a plot of air temperature on the x-axis versus the external temperature on the y-axis should have been a straight line. The 1-to-1 line is a black line here. Those little dotted lines are plus minus 4 degrees. And when you look at the raw data on the left, I've divided it into summer in red and winter in blue. When you look at those, it actually doesn't fall on a 1-to-1 relationship. And this meant that I was missing something. But when I averaged this by the hour of the day, there was something that was quite interesting. During the summer, the average temperature of that unit is near enough to the air temperature. It sits very close to the 1-to-1 line. Just after the midday, from about 2 o'clock until maybe 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, there's a little dip there. There's a reason for that. I'm not going to go into those details now. You can ask it as a question if you want. But the really interesting thing came out in the winter data set. And what we saw is that from about 9 o'clock in the morning, that sensor on the back of the head became warmer than air temperature. And you can see from about 9 o'clock in the morning up until about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, that sensor was warmer than the air. This was a clue to what the crocodiles were up to at that time. It's pretty much like when I walked to my car yesterday, the air temperature was fine. When I got in the car, it was hot. This is the effect of the crocodiles basking in the sun, gathering as much heat as they can. And that sensor would... Now, this is going to turn out to be important. The next thing that I was interested to see is, what about the body temperature? These are ectotherms. So I would have thought, and I'm very naive about this, I would have thought that there would have been quite a linear correlation between the temperature of your reptile and the temperature of the air. That's what I was led to believe from a little child. But what we see is very strong cycling. Again, a big difference between summer and winter. And when I break that down by the hour of the day, I think this is fascinating. What we see is that during summer, between about 8 o'clock in the morning and 7 o'clock at night, during the day, the crocodiles are cooler than the air temperature. At night, during summer, the crocodiles are warmer than the air temperature. They plot above the 1-to-1 line. Winter is very interesting. What we see is that the temperature, as the day temperature increases, the crocodile temperature doesn't increase initially. So up until about 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock in the morning, the sun is up, but the crocodiles are not getting any warmer. And then suddenly they warm quite rapidly. And if you remember what I said previously about the crocodiles lying in the sun and basking at a certain time of the day, you see at that time the crocodile temperature suddenly starts to go up. But what's important here is that this is winter, and the crocodiles are spending most of the day warmer than air temperature. In fact, most of the night as well. So how doth the little crocodile do it? To understand this, I want to resolve these into time series. So I've now plotted the average temperatures of the air, the average temperatures of the crocodile as a function of time in the day. I've split it between summer and winter. In blue is the air temperature, and in red is the crocodile's core temperature. And there's two things that really strike me about this. The first is that, I'll start off on the right, in winter. The red line spends more time above the blue line, which is what I said previously. The crocodiles are warmer than air temperature for most of the day. You can see that the very rapid increase in the internal temperature occurs at the time that we know that they're basking. So basking is very important. It allows the crocodile to generate heat sufficiently that it compensates for whatever heat loss happens overnight. So when the sun sets, everything gets cooler, the crocodile gets cooler, but by the time the sun rises the next morning, the crocodiles are still warmer than air temperature. The second thing that I noticed about this is, let's start off with the summer. When the sun rises in Kruger National Park in summer, it's around about 5 o'clock in the morning. The temperature starts going up. So your temperature minimum is, let's call it 5 o'clock in the morning. The crocodile temperature minimum happens more like 9 o'clock in the morning. So there's a delay. If we look at the peak temperature, it's the same thing. The daily temperature, the air temperature peaks, and 4 hours later, the crocodile temperature peaks. The same delays, well, not exactly the same, but we have similar delays in winter. How doth the crocodile do this? Now, I'm going to answer that in a moment, but I just want to take a very short excursion into the orange. That's the activity. I'm putting this in because it's Stefan's guide to when not to swim in Kruger National Park. What you notice is that during summer, the crocodiles are more active than in winter. Yeah, they're ectotherms. But what we see is that their activity coincides with the lowest body temperature. So where the red line in summer reaches its nadir, that's when their activity peaks. And what they do is at the end of the day, they stop being active because that would generate metabolic heat during the hottest part of the day, and it would heat them up. So there's a behavioral response here that is avoiding hyperthermia from getting too hot. Right, back to this thermal lag. I can take these data sets and I can take the temperature and I can shift it to the left. You see they're out of phase at the moment, but if I do a little shift, I can get them to be in phase. And what it says is that if the day temperature starts going up, so many hours later, whatever the lag is, then the crocodile temperature goes up. When the air temperature starts going down, so many hours later, the crocodile temperature starts going. I can get them in phase with this shift. And when I look at what the timing is of this lag, it's patterned through time. And what we see is that the lags are greatest during the summer months, and this is when the crocodiles are at their best condition. During winter, they're using up their fat reserves, and the lag time drops to about 2 hours. And so the thickness of their fat layer seems to be a very strong indicator of what's going on. It's not just acting as a nutrient reserve to get them through winter, it's acting as an insulator as well. Now, I want to just point out the behavior of one mischievous crocodile. On the right is the data that we got from 4 crocodiles, which were behaving normally. The black data is the head temperature sensor, and you can see it oscillates. Underneath that, there's actually a blue temperature record. You can't see it because it's swamped by the head temperature. And the red is the body temperature. And you can see nice. That's a perfectly normal, what we would have expected from this data set. But one crocodile number 4, at exactly the same time, this is in the depth of winter. This crocodile, if you look at the black trace never exceeds really, at least not during the day, the air temperature, which is in blue. This tells us that the crocodile was not basking. If it's not basking, it's in the water. As a consequence of that, we see in the red trace that the body temperature drops. And there's a slight recovery during the day, and that's because the water's warming up, but the next night, the temperatures drop. This crocodile is not defending its core temperature, and it's not basking. And this tells us that the basking of the crocodiles is absolutely critical. Now, what was this crocodile doing? We can go to the tracking data, and we can see where was it. Now, for those 6 days or so, that crocodile had one GPS position. It did not move. We know it was active. The accelerometer says it was doing something. And that point, which is at the southern basin of Lake Massingier, just below Lago Nova, that's where that crocodile was. Now that is just opposite a fishing village. And I'm pretty sure that what he was doing there was raiding fish nets. So here was a little crocodile that doth eat fish. But if you are going to go and raid the nets from those fishermen, they are not going to be happy. And we've seen plenty of evidence of spear wounds on crocodiles and so on. That crocodile knew, do not go and spend time at the surface. It stayed where it was, but it didn't spend time on the surface, because if it did, it was going to get hammered by the fishermen. So what this tells us is that basking turns out to be really important to crocodiles. When you see crocodiles basking like this, they're not goofing off. They are really doing everything they can to capture as much heat as they can to be able to have heat reserves to get through the next night. Now, to understand this, I'm working with Shannon, so she's going to talk a little bit about this tomorrow. But we're trying to model what's going on here using models that really understand both behavior and the biology of the crocodiles. And so I look forward to what Shannon has to say about it, but I also look forward to the results that we're eventually going to get. And so let me just conclude with this. How doth the little crocodile deal with temperature? It turns out that basking, if a crocodile can't bask, it's in trouble. If it can't bask for a long time, it's in trouble. A few days is fine, it'll recover. They also have this really unique behavior, which it's like a thermal hysteresis, where they have their body temperatures lag air temperature. The consequence of that is that on the coldest nights in winter, the crocodiles never get that cold. They will be slightly warmer. During the hottest days in summer, the crocodiles never get that hot. They'll be a little bit cooler. So they're mitigating the extremes of temperature and the risk of hypo and hypothermia. Now the pansteatitis thing. So what happened? We knew they were eating fish. We knew where it was happening, and we know that we had a change in the physical layout of the gorge. And what now I propose on the basis of this evidence is that when that gorge was initially back-flooded, the crocodiles ate fish, but they didn't have anywhere to go and bask. And as a result, having lost all of their basking area, they were stuck in the water. They got colder and colder, like our truant number 4 crocodile. But there was no respite. And as a result, any fish that they had eaten became putrid in their stomach. It's the association between putrid fish, consumption of putrid fish, and pansteatitis that we see in other species. And it seems as if temperature was the cause of the inability to bask, and the metabolic impact on temperature was probably the final factor in explaining the pansteatitis epidemic. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have a minute or two for 2 questions.
Stephen, thanks for a great talk. I'm interested, what percentage of the crocodiles died, and those that didn't die, they couldn't bask. What happened there? They also had the fish, they were also eating those fish, I'm sure.
Yes, astute. I know that you're going to ask the right questions. No, you can imagine there were 180 odd crocodiles that died. Now, 180 crocodiles in a very short area. That's the thing is that it's not that there were no basking areas, but the dominant crocodiles got them. So if you were not dominant, if you didn't migrate out, and if you did migrate out, you're going to meet another dominant crocodile. That was the problem. If you weren't dominant, no basking.
Any other questions?
Thank you. That was a really great talk. I'm not sure if you mentioned it, but I'm just interested, what was your sample size?
18 crocodiles?
18. Okay. Thank you so much.
One final question? Anyone? No. Thank you very much. Next up, we have Dilys Rowe, and her question is, should wild animal welfare be considered in conservation?
Thanks very much. Yes, my name's Dilys Rowe. I'm the Biodiversity and Conservation Lead at the International Institute for Environment and Development, IIED, which is a sustainable development think tank based in the UK. And I'm also the chair of the IUCN Sustainable Use and Livelihood Specialist Group, which is a network of over 300 wildlife management professionals with some interest and hopefully expertise in sustainable use. So here I'm going to address the question, should wild animal welfare be considered in conservation, introducing you to 2 pieces of research that's explored this issue, one led by myself and the other led by Amy Dickman and Lauren Harrington at the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit at the University of Oxford. And I just wanted to start by saying it's great to be here. This is my first Oppenheimer conference, so really appreciate the opportunity to talk. And I'm already blown away by how great this is, just the venue, the organization, the quality of the talks, and everything about it. It's such a refreshing change, having just come straight from the IUCN World Conservation Congress in Abu Dhabi, which had too many people, too much bureaucracy, was too hot, and just general quite a lot of chaos going on there. So it's really, really nice to be here. It's also really nice and a real novelty for me to be talking about animal welfare. Although I started my career working for an animal welfare research institute, for the last 30 years I've been working on issues around community conservation and sustainable use in Africa. And normally when I'm standing on a stage like this, I'm talking about trophy hunting or some other controversial sustainable use issue that animal welfare people really hate. And today I'm talking about animal welfare, which a lot of conservation and sustainable use people really hate. So lots of hatred from both sides, and interested to see where the land lies with this one. So why this question? And it's really for the very simple reason that animal welfare has been a concern for very many people for a long time, but it's often perceived to be at odds with conservation, hence this divide. You're either sort of for animal welfare or you're for sustainable use, and there doesn't seem to be a bridge between the two. And particularly for conservation programs that focus on sustainable use and involve the capture and killing of wild animals. Animal welfare laws and regulations have been around for decades, but they generally apply to either domesticated animals or to captive wild animals. So pets, zoo animals, laboratory animals, livestock, and sometimes farmed game. So as this horrible case from Wyoming in the US shows, it's sometimes actually really difficult legislatively to apply animal welfare laws to wild animals. So in this case, this person deliberately ran over a young female wolf with a snowmobile, injured it but didn't kill it, put tape around the muzzle of the wolf, dragged it into a bar and paraded it around the bar, and then took it out and shot it. Initially, the person was just fined $250 for illegal possession of a wild animal. There was no fine for animal cruelty, no animal welfare consideration there. Recently, this decision has been challenged by a grand jury, and the guy's now been indicted with an offence of felony animal cruelty, which has a much more significant fine and even a prison sentence. If he's found guilty, it's yet to come to court, but if he's found guilty, it'll be a significant change in law for Wyoming, the state where it happened. And also elsewhere across the world, we see increasing interest and attention to when and how animal welfare standards should be applied to wild animals and to conservation. So here in South Africa, for example, as I'm sure many of you know, 2023 white paper passed on the conservation and sustainable use of South Africa's biodiversity. And this emphasized that the well-being of individual animals as well as populations of wild animals should be integrated into biodiversity policy and legislation, as well as into conservation and sustainable use practices. And there's been a heated debate, which I think is still ongoing, about the formalization of this as a legal requirement. Globally, the link between animal welfare and wild animals really came to the fore with the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, when the links were drawn between the condition under which wild animals are harvested and kept and the likelihood of the spillover of zoonotic diseases to humans. So evidence does show that zoonotic pathogens emerge more frequently in stressed and sick animals. So there is a logic to this argument, but at the same time, zoonotic disease risk doesn't mean that there should be no use of wild animals. And many, including myself, considered that COVID-19 was really being used as a convenient cover to push an existing animal welfare agenda. But it did make me and others think that although a firm advocate of sustainable use, perhaps the world has changed and we did need to reconsider what sustainability really means in a post-pandemic world where we are sort of more aware of disease risks and where there's much more attention being paid to animal sentience and animal health and welfare. So hence the 50 Shades of Sustainability project was born, involving my organisation IAD and the IUCN Sustainable Use and Livelihoods Group, Traffic, the Endangered Wildlife Trust, and Epic Biodiversity. And it was funded by the UK government's Darwin Initiative. And we started with rethinking the conceptual framework for sustainability. Most conventional depictions and descriptions of sustainability are illustrated either with 3 pillars or 3 overlapping circles, where you see these dimensions of economic sustainability, social sustainability, and ecological or environmental sustainability intertwining and overlapping, with sustainability there in the middle where these things overlap. Under our project, we developed a revised conceptual framework that took an expanded concept by bringing in 2 other dimensions, one around human health and the other around animal health and welfare. And what we did was conduct an extensive literature review where we looked at all the existing guidelines and standards and principles that we could find that were out there that related to one or more of these 5 dimensions that we had identified. So examples of information that we looked at were things like the CITES non-detriment findings guidance. So non-detriment findings is the assessment process that you carry out under CITES if you're contemplating exporting a species that's listed on one of the CITES appendices. And you have to conduct an assessment to prove that the trade in that species is not going to be detrimental to the survival of that species. So it just addresses the dimension of ecological sustainability. We looked at the World Organization for Animal Health's guidance on animal health and welfare, which obviously just addresses that one dimension of animal health and welfare. But other things such as the Fair Wild Standard, which is a certification scheme for wild harvested plants, addresses multiple dimensions, so including ecological sustainability, but also social sustainability, labor law conditions, and so on. And we went through all of these existing guidelines, standards, principles, and pulled out, deconstructed them and allocated all of their constituent parts into one of our 5 dimensions. And then we synthesized all of these down and came up with 7 core principles for each of our 5 dimensions, as well as 7 cross-cutting principles which were relevant to all of the dimensions, and they concerned issues such as legality, traceability, adaptive management, and so on. We really desperately wanted to come up with 50 principles overall so that we could justify our 50 Shades of Sustainability name, but we only had 42, so it's 42 Shades of Sustainability. That's what we had to stick with. All of the principles aren't engraved on my heart, but just to tell you about the welfare principles, the first 6 relate to the conditions in which animals are kept or how they're handled or killed by humans. So they build on the 5 freedoms or the 5 domains which are kind of like a recognized international standard for animal welfare. And these refer to things like freedom from hunger, freedom from fear, availability of shelter, and so on. So the first 4 of them relate to provision of appropriate food and nutrition and water, provision of appropriate shelter, stocking densities and group composition that allow for natural behaviors, and appropriate treatment of sick animals. 2 of them then address the way that humans treat animals, how they catch, handle, contain, or kill them. So they'd only apply to animals they'd apply to animals in the wild as well as animals in captivity, whereas the first 4 only really apply to captive or enclosed animals where humans actually have some control over their welfare. So the 2 that apply to wild animals as well are the fact that if you are capturing, containing, handling, or killing wild animals, you should do this in a way that minimizes pain, stress, and suffering. And you should also do this in a way that minimizes disease transmission. And then the 7th principle is about the capabilities of humans that are working with animals, either as hunters or in any other context. It's about your knowledge of species biology, your knowledge about the kind of instruments that you're using, the weapons that you're using if you're going hunting, and so on. What we then did was take our principles and we developed a tool to support the application of the principles. It's an Excel spreadsheet-based tool. I'm not expecting you to be able to read this, but for every single one of those 42 principles, we came up with 4 indicators that indicated a level of alignment of your practice with the principle. And the indicators reflect bad practice and then increasingly good practice up to exemplar practice. So bad practice, for example, for the first principle about provision of adequate food and water would be there's no evidence that adequate food and water has been provided, or there is evidence that animals are looking neglected. And what you do is you score each of the principles on a score of 1 to 4 for each of these. And the tool generates a radar chart at the end, and it shows you how your initiative scored against each of the dimensions. So the 6 points of the radar chart reflect the 5 dimensions, and the closer you are into the green zone reflects the higher score that you got for each of those dimensions. We piloted this tool in a number of different initiatives: wild meat industry in Tanzania, trophy hunting of crocodiles in Zimbabwe, python harvesting in Indonesia, and here in South Africa we looked at game ranching with research conducted by the Endangered Wildlife Trust. And these are just the results showing you how sort of different initiatives fare. This first radar chart comes from the one game ranch which was managed as a private wildlife reserve, scores really highly on ecological sustainability, but not that high on social sustainability because it was a private reserve with very little involvement of local people. Second one was a game ranch which was really focused on producing commercial meat for export and very cognizant of international health and welfare standards, so scored very highly there. And the third one was a mixed game ranch where they had tourism, biltong hunting, trophy hunting and all sorts, and scored sort of averagely across the board. When I first presented this framework, it was met with horror by somebody in my specialist group who is a real advocate of trophy hunting, who told me that this was a terrible thing to be introducing animal welfare into the concept of sustainable use. And, really, if I was doing this, I ought to be ashamed of myself. And I was really surprised by the reaction because if you go hunting, you think about what kind of weapon am I using? What caliber bullet am I using? And that is animal welfare, even if we don't think about it like that and label it as that. So we went back to the wider specialist group and asked the question, what does everybody else think about how relevant this is? And overall, the responses were much more positive that, yes, we do think this is important. And they were generally for sort of both pragmatic and ethical reasons. Some people really highlighted that ecological sustainability has to come first and then welfare can follow, and highlighted that you could have a high welfare situation, but that the use could still be unsustainable. But overall, people recognize that if you introduce animal welfare and make it as good as possible, that's good for the animal, it's good for the person that's doing the hunting, and it usually makes economic sense if you're into a sustainable use initiative that has a commercial dimension to it. And many people highlighted examples of where welfare is already codified and incorporated into wildlife management practices. So as I said, one of the principles is about how you catch and kill wild animals and how you do that in a way that minimizes pain and suffering. But how do you know which ways to kill animals are good and which are bad? So this relates to some work that Oxford University are doing where they're looking at different kinds of ways of killing animals and looking at the welfare, comparing those from a welfare basis. So they did this through a process of getting assessors to look at welfare before and during death and coming up with a welfare index and combining those suffering before death and suffering during death to come up with a welfare index. These are the results, some preliminary results from their study that's looking at comparing optimal gun shooting with poor gun shooting, with spearing, bow shooting, poisoning. And it shows you, for lions in particular, overall, that the highest welfare deaths were brought about by good gun shooting and good bow shooting, and the rest were long-duration spearing. It also showed that with some kinds of killing, by good practice, you can improve welfare. So the graph here shows the difference between poor gun shooting and optimal shooting. If you make if you improve the practice around gun shooting, you can improve welfare. Other practices like poisoning, you can't really change the practice. Poisoning is poisoning and causes a lot of suffering. So just thinking about the way forwards, we do think that welfare consideration in conservation aren't going away, and perhaps they shouldn't go away. And tools such as these can really help us identify where the welfare risks are, but also where there are opportunities to improve them and address them. We can't resolve the debate about animal welfare or sustainable use, but we can certainly help and inform that debate and start to build bridges. So just to end, to show you that the tool is available online, and it gives you links to all the spreadsheets and everything. We're really keen to try this out in as many contexts as possible and encourage feedback from it. We're hoping to roll this out very soon. And the good and bad ways of killing is one of the posters that's being displayed. Sorry, if I can go back to that. In the poster session. So please go and talk to Lauren and Amy about that. And please do follow up with us by email if you're interested in this issue and interested to carry on the conversation. So thanks very much for listening.
We do have time for one question. Is there a question? No. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Patience Gandiwe, and she's going to be talking to the applicability of environmental management systems for effective management of trans-frontier conservation areas. Thank you.
I think it's already midday, almost. And yeah, I think I'm deciding to talk about the naughty crocodile and what it's doing across borders. And maybe then add 100 shades of TFCA EMS issues in addition to what Dilys was just talking about. So if we're not listening to their presentation, sorry. Anyway, many of you might be wondering, actually, what are trans-frontier conservation areas? And when I look around the room, I think I can see quite a good fraction of the audience that are a bit familiar with what are these trans-frontier conservation areas. So I'm just going to give you some brief highlights and then share with you some of the preliminary findings and perceptions around TFCAs and also how we can apply the EMS gold standards. And yeah, and I think it's important that I put it up front that this has been really a management need-driven research than just a research for academic or other purposes. There have been some brick walls that we have had to hit, and also some of the emerging requirements from our various donor community that have, from time to time, always been reflecting about the needs for standards and protocols. So just maybe some say photos or videos, they can maybe say it better or explain it better. So for the sake of some of our audience that may not be familiar what are these TFCAs, I'm just going to play this video. It's in public domain on YouTube. I'm not going to finish playing it. You can always play it at your own time. But I think I like how it explains what are these TFCAs better than what my words can say. And
the Southern African Development Community, or SADC, was born of a vision to ensure economic well-being improvement in the standards of living and quality of life for the peoples of Southern Africa. SADC comprises 15 member states and is a region abounding in natural and cultural wealth. The vast and breathtaking landscapes are studded with countless treasures. However, wildlife, as well as rivers and even culture, do not neatly follow the arbitrary lines on a map that make up national boundaries. The movement of these resources is essential for maintaining population health, viability and resilience to change in the long term. These landscapes are essential to the continued provision of fundamental ecosystem services upon which we, as human race, rely. This is especially true in a world where our footprint as humans is continuing to dissect biological habitats and erode the natural resource base. Consequently, these resources cannot be considered only national assets, but regional and global assets for which the duty of responsibility must be shared. In stark contrast to the rich biodiversity that these nodes offer, they often characterize high levels of poverty amongst the human populations that host these resources, as they bear the highest opportunity cost of being their direct custodians. A combination of factors lock these populations in a tight cycle of poverty, including limited rights to use the resource base, meager livelihood options, inadequate service provision or access to services, and high levels of human-wildlife conflict. The resources upon which these populations rely so heavily are often not managed in a coherent manner by the corresponding agencies across international borders. And this has serious implications not only for the resource in question, but also on human livelihoods. Defined in the SADC Protocol on Wildlife Conservation and Law Enforcement of 1999 as the area or component of a large ecological region that straddles the boundaries of two or more countries, encompassing one or more protected areas as well as multiple resource use areas. Transfrontier conservation areas or peace parks differ substantially in spatial parameters and the mix of land use categories. Those adjoining protected areas are referred to as transfrontier parks. Those that encompass an area of multiple resource use areas are referred to as transfrontier conservation areas or TFCAs. Currently, there are 18 existing and potential TFCAs in SADC in both terrestrial and marine environments at different stages of development. While there is no international convention for TFCAs, these initiatives complement the goals and objectives of a series of international conservation-related conventions. And IUCN has identified over 227 transboundary protected areas worldwide. TFCAs offer a platform for dialogue between countries.
So, yes, you can always watch that video at your own pace and finish it, but it's really quite interesting. What are these TFCAs? And there's a cocktail of protocols at regional level that have actually necessitated or even are facilitating the implementation of the TFCA program. And protocols, what's important is that these are actually legally binding instruments that bring parties together. And because TFCAs were born out of the SADC Protocol on Wildlife Conservation and Law Enforcement of 1999, there are certain considerations that we need to make or to be mindful of, especially when we look back 25 years on when this program was initiated. And right now we do have the SADC TFCA program 10-year strategy, which was approved by SADC ministers responsible for wildlife. And these have got 5 goals. And as we're looking at these goals, We need to also be reflecting in terms of how are we measuring progress, and also how are we harmonizing our standards and processes, for example, to achieve integrated and effective management of transboundary landscapes and also seascapes. How are we making sure that there is improvement in terms of the well-being and livelihoods of people through various initiatives that are not limited to agriculture, fisheries, forestry, and other livelihood options. And there's need also to be thinking about the tools and solutions or mechanisms that are at our disposal in relation to the 3 goals, Goal 3, Goal 4, and Goal 5 of the SADC TFCA program. And of course, being mindful of the cross-cutting themes, and I think there are several talks that have been given during this conference that relate to issues of climate change, mitigation and adaptation, and also ensuring that there is a just energy transition, and various factors relating to how these landscapes or conservation areas or protected and conserved areas are actually also contributing to livelihoods of the people that are inhabiting in these landscapes. And there are some guiding principles. When we look at environmental and social justice as a principle, do we have the gold standard that is being applied across the 13 actually TFCAs following the revised program? Initially you had in the video, which was produced a number of years ago, about 18, but there were some reviews that were done. How are we also measuring or ensuring accountability and also transparency, which is acceptable to the modern day standards and expectations, especially in the face of competing needs on limited financial and other resources? So with this backdrop, for Zimbabwe, pursuing the transboundary conservation agenda beyond the protected area estate is not just a nice thing for us to do, it's actually a necessity. There's no way that Zimbabwe can support the second largest population of elephants in the world, looking at the just over 5 million hectares that is gazetted protected areas. But what's important is that we really have to pursue this conservation agenda beyond the protected area network across various different categories of protected areas into conserved areas. Some may call them in modern day lingo other effective area-based conservation measures. But also of particular note is that Zimbabwe has got a diverse flora and fauna. And when you look at the area where wildlife conservation is actually a recognized land use area, it's almost 28% of the country. Therefore, why are we pursuing conservation at scale? And where does scale matter? Spatial scale really is important when it comes to effective conservation of wide-ranging species, some which are listed under the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species, such as elephants. Those species that also roam our skies, such as vultures, that do not know any political boundary. And we know that, and it's not a secret that wildlife do not recognize all these political boundaries, and they have to straddle across boundaries, not only international boundaries, but multiple land use boundaries also. And the protected area system on its own cannot sustain the needs of several other species. I can talk about the Zimbabwe's cheetah population, for example. Maybe 90% is actually found outside the protected area estate. Talk about the rhino population of Zimbabwe. Almost maybe 70% is actually on private land. So these are very important land areas that are also contributing to the species conservation from a meta-population management, but also to a landscape level conservation. And this is very important if we are to meet the 23 targets for the Global Biodiversity Framework under the CBD, which we adopted, and also making sure that we are creating enabling conditions at national and also regional level to pursue those agendas, the species-related targets, but also some of the targets that requires us to transform our way of doing business and also our way of thinking, especially when you look at target 15 or maybe target 18, Some of these frameworks and targets, they only make sense when they are being pursued also at not only at park level, but also at national level, but even beyond the national boundaries. And this is very important. So for us, I'll emphasize that wildlife conservation and effective conservation of the Zimbabwean components of this TFCA landscape is actually a necessity. We do not have actually option B to maintain and sustain these species. Just to give an example, for example, in the Great Limpopo Transfrontier Conservation Area, I've been a resident ecologist in Gonarejo National Park, which is the second largest park in Zimbabwe, for almost 6 years of my life, doing research there. And surely there's no biology that can explain the elephant population in that park. And I think basically it shows or indicates that there must be several ecological refugees from the other side of the border that found refuge in this park. Why? Because there's safety, food, and also effective management. And for us to solve this elephant density issue that we are actually really grappling with, we need to make TFCAs work. And this is why we have been having regional frameworks for elephant conservation in the Great Limpopo TFCA, but also even in the Kavango Zambezi TFCA. Zimbabwe is pursuing 6 initiatives for TFCAs, 5-country initiative in the Northwest, involving Hwange National Park, the Kavango Zambezi TFCA, the Great Limpopo TFCA with South Africa and Mozambique. This includes Gonarejo National Park, Greater Mapungubwe TFCA in the southwest part of the country, which involves Botswana and South Africa, and the Tuliseko Safari area. And then we've got a bilateral Chimanimani TFCA, and the new baby on the block is actually the Zimoza TFCA with Mozambique and Zambia. And 2 years ago, we saw our principal signing the Lower Zambezi Manapus TFCA. And this is really a growing network of commitments, and also these agreements, they come with obligations. But we need to be always asking ourselves and reflecting, what is it that we are doing? How is the institutional infrastructure framed in such a way that we are able to effectively meet our national and also regional obligations? We've got the approved SADC law enforcement and anti-poaching strategy, which also has got requirements and reporting obligations. So what should we be thinking? What is missing, really? 25 years down the line, we've got a cocktail of instruments and tools that are already available. Is there anything that we need more? Can we be continuously looking for new tools and solutions? How better can we scale up and do better and achieve much more in this landscape? We know we've got guidelines, SADC guidelines for this and that. We know agreements are there, they were signed and deposited with the SADC Secretariat. We've got standards. We've got laws at national level. We've got standard operating procedures that have been developed. But when you look at it, it has mainly been also a piecemeal approach. And where we don't have standards or specific documents approved, we talk about established practice to say, okay, this is how we have been doing it anyway. But is that the best approach? There are several obligations and also resolutions, guidelines, strategies that we are adopting each and every year, maybe every 2 years, every 3 years. When you look at the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species, there are manuals. But how, in all this maze, how can we apply the environmental management system framework to assist this program implementation and also harmonization beyond just the compliance monitoring of the essential elements that we need to be tracking? And yes, what is this environmental management system anyway? It's very important that we understand that this is not a new concept at all, but as much as it is not new, it's one thing to have tools and solutions produced, but it's completely another to have those tools and solutions operationalized. It has got a 4-stage iterative strategic approach which is just mainly aimed at continuous improvement. And of course, involves systematically evaluating potential solutions and assessing observations and findings, which is almost like a learning by doing approach. And is this PDCA model applicable to the context of TFCA when you look at those 5 objectives or goals that I shared with you earlier? And at the center of this model is actually leadership. And I showed you a slide with the institutional infrastructure or institutional framework of the TFCA program. How applicable is this when you look at from a planning, through a planning lens? How can we apply this model even in terms of performance evaluation and compliance? We decided to gather data from the 6 TFCA initiatives that Zimbabwe is involved in, and so far we have covered 4, so it's ongoing research. And we have been exploring the status quo to say, just to take a stock of how we are doing things at the moment, and where can we make improvements. We've done field visits, we've done key informant interviews, and also conducted some meetings where over 300 people have participated, and also some interviews with some key informants that are not necessarily based in this landscape or in Zimbabwe. So through the planning lens, there was a very fascinating and interesting process that we got involved in eastern part of the Kaza TFCA on the Zimbabwean component around the Binga area, where the community was very actively involved, and we took a very slightly different approach just to see how EMS can also help us do better or plan better. And there's also another project which was funded by the Global Environment Facility in the Mid-Zambezi Valley in the Lower Zambezi Manapus area, where we also produced some plans in a very widely participatory and consultative process. And we also have been working on a land use plan at transboundary level with Zambia. And that transboundary land use plan was completed, of course, with assistance of the CMS Secretariat. And what's interesting, or what's coming out of this approach, is that we have seen that it's actually possible to do actually integrated land use planning and consider a different approach to zoning, but with a very participatory approach, so that because connectivity and also ensuring corridors are available and secured, and engraving coexistence principles at planning stage is very important. And this is some of the work that we have done around Matusadona National Park in collaboration with funding support from the African Parks Network under our collaborative management framework for this park. And one inspiring outcome of this process is that this plan was developed in a widely consultative way, but it didn't take away the ownership of this plan, because outside the protected area, there are other planning authorities such as the Rural District Council. And actually the minister, who is not the Minister of Wildlife, actually launched this plan very recently. So we've seen that it's actually possible. And there was a difference to how we have been doing this as compared to how we have developed other plans or contributed effectively to planning beyond the protected area, because sometimes people talk about mandate. The same we can do with, we have been doing with environmental awareness and education. There's so many initiatives that are being implemented in these TFCAs. But how do we ensure that there is equitable support and frameworks for environmental education and awareness at landscape level, the whole TFCA, because you can imagine that in Great Limpopo TFCA, maybe we have been prioritizing schools around 15-kilometer radius. Yet the landscape is so huge. What about those other schools? Also, how are we rolling it out beyond? We know resources are limited. Bicycles. Not so long ago, we are giving some bicycles for kids that are attending some school in Victoria Falls at Chinotimba, where the whole school with 267 students, every child received a bicycle, and we've been mobilizing these resources with our partners so that they're encouraged to go to secondary school, which was a little bit far, but these are wildlife-dominated landscapes, so that we are able to invest in the future. How are we also have been using the radio communication systems and community-based radios, and also introducing ICT more effectively and equitably. Honestly, the answer has been there is no standard approach. Each TFCA has been doing its own thing, and some of the things have been very opportunistic. But also even use of drone technology. Its application use. Can you fly your drone across the river? Maybe you're looking at invasive species on the Zambezi or on the Limpopo. What are the joint research and monitoring needs that we need as far as capacitation and also use of technology is concerned? Same with tourism. There's a lot that the EMS framework itself and approach can help us standardize how we look at community tourism or even tourism development in general. And even when it comes to human resource investments, how can we use EMS? We've been reflecting on this in terms of giving more opportunities for communities. Yes, around Matusadona, 80% of the staff is coming from the communal area, similarly for Gonorejo. But what about in other TFCA? Are we adopting the same approach? The more recent, new upcoming TFCA, are we having a standard when it comes to community beneficiation and also various other livelihood alternatives that we are implementing? We need to ensure that there is also equity in all these considerations, be it human-wildlife conflict mitigation and management initiatives, and also even access in terms of opportunities for aquaculture, etc., within the TSA. We've also been seeing how we have been having these response mechanisms. There was some drought not so long ago, and in 1 or 2 TFCAs, we have been able to respond to have a feeding program for the school kids, food handouts for the other communities. But is it equitable throughout what is the standard? Are we not also going to create resentment and other unforeseen or unplanned challenges? We need to have this in our planning and in our thinking. And it's very important. This is why we have been really driven to find ways and explore how we can engrave EMS standard in terms of policy. And these are some of the preliminary findings from the deliberate management-driven research that we've been doing, establishing rules and procedures, risk assessment, and also even reporting. Why this has been really important is that we've got that institutional infrastructure or framework which can make decisions that are legally binding, and that can also help us have this gold standard in terms of how we can move forward together and have more standardized approach to the implementation of the TFCA program. And so how have we been doing it? Inspired by the SADC TFCA financing facility funded projects and other donor funded projects such as the German Development Bank through KfW, even the UNDP project. But this SADC TFCA financing facility, I think it is really inspiring some approach that we can also consider, not only for the SADC TSA financing facility, but having generic gold standard for all projects, programs, and also how we approach things in the TFCA program. We can talk about environmental and social monitoring and reporting template, not only for the SADC TSA funded project, but also even guidance on project level, grievance and redress mechanisms. Sometimes really, we have had to think about this when we run into problems and when we've encountered certain situations. Then we start to think, how do we? But we didn't think about it at project inception level. There are various donor-funded projects in these TSA landscapes, but there is no gold standard that is really standardizing the approach of how we are doing these things. And we've got these already tailored to a specific programming framework under SADC, but it can be scalable. It can also be customizable to the various levels and also applicability needs that we need. And we are going to be sharing, hopefully in the near future, about what extent that we can customize this and also implement, how we have implemented or applied such standards at a landscape level. We believe, therefore, that a multi-scale and multi-phased approach to EMS application is very necessary, and we need to think about metrics, social assessment, indices, how TFCA projects are impacting on people. Beyond even IMET, we know there are limitations to all these tools and standards, but governance issues. And there's no single metrics or single approach that can give us any indications on how TFCAs are performing. There's just a cocktail of all these, and we need innovation in this space so that we are able to track progress and make sure that we can be able to reflect on what right things that we are doing, that we might be doing wrong, and what are the wrong things that we can correct, and what are the right things that we need to keep on doing, and make sure that we continue to do research and generate new knowledge that can help inspire transformative landscapes that are necessary for the survival of species. And there are some preliminary or emerging recommendations that we are already considering or tailoring to our context for the TFCAs that are involving Zimbabwe. For example, to make sure that we do this environmental review and make sure that there is some planning that is being done or some scoping, and also make sure that we have a good idea of the environmental policy commitments that we need to be mindful of in all the thematic areas, and make sure that we jointly set these objectives. And when we say jointly, it's not only across borders, but across the multi-stakeholder framework that we operate in, and make sure that we jointly make attempts to harmonize the legal and other policy requirements. But not only required, because most of these policies that we say in law, they're only shaped by governments and never really developed with input of donors. But it's high time that in these landscapes that we make sure that we also include those expectations and standards that are expected by our donor community that are supporting and driving also TFCA processes, and making sure that we've got warm bodies that are responsible for ensuring monitoring and implementation of these processes. So this is ongoing research, as I already informed you, and we believe that it's going to result in some practical guidance that will be very useful in overcoming some of the hurdles that we are seeing at the moment. And there are some emerging opportunities also where we believe that even thinking about these EMS standards, or even thinking about biodiversity credits, how can we already think about unlocking the full potential of the biodiversity economy strategy, but also contributing to the Zimbabwe's biodiversity economy strategy, thinking about or mainstreaming or making sure that EMS standards and accountability and responsibility, we always think about it. And perhaps in future, we can be able to see an EMS-based regional outlook for TFCAs, or the status of TFCAs in Southern Africa, or even at any level, so that we are able to be really accountable and reporting back more effectively on metrics that are standardized across the different landscapes. I want to thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for one quick question. Any takers? At the back there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation that actually reflects on how countries should be working together, because the ecosystems do not respect political boundaries. I just have actually I have a number of questions, but I'll just ask one, maybe I'll follow you on the other questions. In terms of implementation of the agreed activities across the different countries, if you could share your experience in terms of are each countries committing enough resources to achieve the common objective for the transfrontier conservation area? And if so, are there mechanisms for reporting regularly, where, for instance, one theme that you could have would be having a science policy interaction. What is science saying about this? and what has been found in this country, maybe Zambia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and how the countries, partnering countries, can work together to respond to the recommendations by science. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. In terms of commitment, I believe that the commitment is there because I believe when our leadership append their signatures to those agreements, they are very fully aware of the obligations that come with those agreements. But when it comes to effective implementation and deploying resources, including human resources, for advancing those activities or commitments, there is a range, or there are differences there, which due to mainly resource limitations and capacity. So there are differences, but I think as Zimbabwe, not bragging, but I think we've been trying to really demonstrate our seriousness in terms of implementation of the program. We do not have any TFCA without a home body that is responsible for driving the agenda in that landscape. But that's not the same for other countries. And in terms of reporting, the SADC, the way SADC is structured as far as natural resources management under the Directorate of Food and Agriculture and Natural Resources Management is that there is also a technical committee on wildlife where regular reporting is done, and also updates, particularly with regards to the SADC anti-poaching and law enforcement strategy, but also other relevant thematic areas in line with the 2025 to 2035 SADC strategy for biodiversity conservation. And there are differences also from one country to another in terms of when these the information is pulled together, we always see there are gaps, and sometimes we struggle to add pears and apples, or bananas and oranges. So apart from having a generic monitoring framework for TFCAs, the compliance standards at national level are not always the same, and we need to continue developing SOPs to harmonize those.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Next up, we have Anthony Emenu, who's going to be presenting on triggering rapid scaling of agroforestry.
Thank you for being such a wonderful audience to all the other previous speakers. Now, we've heard about biodiversity, we've heard about scaling, we've also heard about sustainability in different forms, so I think it's about time we throw in agriculture there. And in this sense, the logical point to start would be to remind ourselves of the critical role agriculture plays in a number of our different economies. Now, across most of the sub-Saharan Africa, most economies still depend on agriculture significantly, and this is statistics from 2024, just last year, and up to about 70% of the population of Uganda still depends on agriculture for employment, and close to 35% of GDP is contributed to by agriculture in a country like Ethiopia. So the whole point of this is to underpin the importance of the sector. Now, most of the food we might have consumed here and in most countries to date has been produced by smallholder farmers. Now, most of these farmers depend on rain-fed farming, often degraded soils, and because of this, they're highly vulnerable to climate change shocks. According to one of the reports, that's 2022, even when the available adaptation options could be accessed by the smallholders, they can no longer utilize them, largely because of these vulnerabilities that they experience. Now, the few options that are available that could be utilized despite all these challenges is agroforestry. So basically the integration of trees within their farming systems. a key reason why the agroforestry is so attractive is its contribution to biodiversity. I talk of its improvement in the productivity of the existing systems. But most interesting for myself is its possible contribution to a socio-economic well-being of smallholder farmers. That only works provided two conditions are met. The first is that the trees being integrated are appropriate for the farming system within which they are being placed. Then the second thing is that there should be market for the products coming out of that system. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. Now, the problem is that despite all this and plenty of evidence out there, most of the programs promoting agroforestry across the continent struggle to attain scale to the level everyone would be excited about. Of course, there isn't a shortage of evidence either on why some of these programs fail. If you Googled right now, the chances you'd get so many reasons. But what is really unique is that there are very few cases that demonstrate success against the odds. But of course, there is no shortage of outliers, and among those is the International Small Group and Tree Planting Program, TIST. Now, this program has been around since 1999, and is running across most countries in Africa currently, and in India as well. In Uganda specifically, program has been around from 2003 and has scaled to all the different parts of the country, with the scaling spiking slightly after 2020 and delivering so many socioeconomic benefits, environmental and ecological benefits as well along the scaling pathway. Now, a key benefit I'd like to draw attention to is the carbon finance that the farmers have been able to access through this program. But none of this is really exciting, right? Reason being that the one thing that makes this program unique is that all this is happening with very minimal investment from the outside. All this is grassroots-driven action, which speaks to sustainability at so many levels. Now, of course, the logical place to start questioning why this program is so successful is the design of the program itself. And the program basically, it's built around smallholder farmers forming groups of 6 to 12, and then 30 to 50 groups form a cluster coordinated by a cluster server, and that's basically an extension worker within the program. But what this program does right, and which makes it stand out, it does two things. One, it gives farmers agency over who is in their groups and the group governance, and two, it gives them agency over the choice of what to plant, where to plant, how to plant, when to plant. And the most exciting bit of that is that it rewards action. So basically, when farmers plant the trees, and the program, once a farmer has planted the tree, the program starts giving them a fraction of what the trees basically, the program gives them a fraction of what they would get from the sale of the carbon captured by the tree. So, and after about a year or two, once the tree is about 2 meters high, they start quantification, and then 70% of all the sales from the global carbon market go back to the farmer. So, so that is one thing that we thought the program did very well, and we wrote that up in a paper that you could access through that QR code. Now, the second bit is we looked at scaling at location level. And of course, we started with places where scaling was very successful. And based on that criteria, we sampled 2 places in Uganda. A location in western Uganda called Bushenyi, which basically has a hilly landscape, has 2 rainfall patterns. And agroforestry is basically the primary land use system there, even before the program. Then the second location is in eastern Uganda, which could be easily described as a grassland. So it has 1 rainfall pattern. Most of the cropping systems rotate around annual crops. And then most of the trees utilized in these homesteads are fruit trees. What we should remember is that in both these locations, there are very high rates of scaling, so very high rates of adoption. So that's one thing we should always keep in mind. And through the engagements, we just try to seek out to understand why the farmers picked interest in the program, why do they stay involved, why do they join in the first place. And then for the leaders, we try to understand the diverse drivers for the scaling in their respective areas, and tried to tease responses to other complaints that came from the farmers as well. At the end of this long exercise, ended up with a total of over 52 interviews across the locations over a 3-month period. And we coded all this into adoption enablers and disenablers. Now, moving on to that, we found that access to land is non-negotiable. So basically, in places where people had access to plenty of land, they went for it, they just took on the program. And where there were difficulties accessing land, the decision was much more complex and slower than we would have preferred. And then where land wasn't a problem, the promise of payments and witnessing other people receive these payments in time became a major attractant to participation. Now, contrary to that, every time people had reports of delays in payment, the majority just chose to step back and wait and see what happened, which basically slowed down the scaling process. Now, most of these delays in payment led into internal conflicts, which manifested in the form of group members blaming their leaders for suspicion of misappropriating the funds, and often this was linked to miscommunication. However, when you interrogate the leaders of the program about what could be causing the delays, they point to policy or operational issues, largely linked to inadequate staffing, a rapid explosion in demand of the services, then occasional equipment failure, and all this eventually leads to a cascading effect that causes some people to just lose interest in the program. Now, overall, and this is a very logical point, basically in places where people are already practicing agroforestry, transition through planting more trees was very easy because for them, this was free money. They were not doing anything different. While in places where agroforestry wasn't a dominant practice, it was more difficult to convince participants. And as I mentioned in the beginning, everyone in this program starts off as a smallholder farmer. So in certain cases, you engage a farmer who turns out to be a local group leader, who turns out to be a pastor in a local church, and some of these people became very influential in providing, giving the program the momentum in recruitment of participants along the way. Now, bringing all this home, we can sum this all up into 4 points. 1, resource access is non-negotiable. So policies at maybe government or institutional level that enable that could drive adoption of agroforestry. And then, of course, institutions that intend to scale have to be prepared to take on the challenge. So basically, once demand explodes and you're not able to meet that, it may not only hurt the scaling process, but it could hurt the reputation of the institution as well and kill all the other interventions coming behind. Then, of course, our consistent and predictable payments of economic incentives are essential to create the initial momentum of scaling, but building markets and creating market linkage could provide for long-term sustainability of this intervention within the spaces. And of course, it always pays to ride the wave of the people who came before you, and preferably either cultivate local passion or identify passionate leaders and work with those. Scaling of these practices is not just about solving one individual problem we might find in literature or promoting a specific innovation. It's about building systems that reinforce so that as a promoter, you could have early retirement and just watch your project grow. So think of it like all the actions you might have in there reinforce each other. An example I've thought of here would be, think of just starting with a smallholder farmer who you did not know was a pastor or a local leader at one point. Then that person influences the local policy, and then the policy opens up spaces for everyone to enroll. But then the flip side is that if that person does not get payments on time, they decampaign the whole program, and then the whole process reverses. So a lot of it is about balance and working with actors, having a shared vision, collaboration between actors, adaptability, but most importantly, giving the right people the agency to make the decisions they have to make when they have to make them. In the case of TIST, it's smallholder farmers. In your case, it could be any actor, it could be the rangers, whatever program you're doing. So this brings me back to my concluding point. Whatever intervention you're trying to scale, whatever ideas you have, the whole point of this presentation is to move from the doom and gloom and tell you that it is possible and there's a mechanism to achieve that, and we are available to have a conversation about how we can help. Now, I'd like to thank the University of Exeter and the Oppenheimer partnership for making all this possible, but most importantly, the smallholder farmers for providing insights that I'm sharing today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. One quick question at the back there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Two quick questions, sorry.
Yeah.
One, are you encouraging the farmers to become organic? And second, who is designing the systems? Is it the farmers, or through education you are supporting them to design the agroforestry systems?
All right, thank you. I did not hear the very first question, but I'll answer the second one, then you can repeat the first one. Now, when it comes to the system design, the program basically has a generic framework. So what happens is farmers register and get recruited. Then at the higher program level, they have a model that ensures that groups meet on a monthly basis. The cluster servant trains, and then they have a tradition of sharing information between group members and different clusters at a higher level. So on a monthly basis, the program releases a newsletter on good practices. That's at the program level, and that's shared across all the program areas in the country. Now, at the farmer level, all the decisions at the group level, when it comes to conflict resolution, who is going to be a member, where to plant, and everything, is done at the farmer level. So every single group has its own modalities of how they deal with problems and how they work out the whole process, but with guidance of a cluster servant who is recruited from the farmers, but remunerated by the program itself.
Thank you.
And the first question?
Just if you're helping them to stop using chemicals.
They don't use chemicals.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And the final presentation for the session is by Dara Hare, and he's going to be discussing morally contested conservation. Thank you.
Hi everyone, can you hear me okay? I won't ask if you can understand me okay. That's a different question. So thanks very much for the opportunity to talk about a research collaboration that we call morally contested conservation. And in this presentation, I'd like to give you an overview of who we are, what we do, why we do it, and some of the findings that we've got so far. So the background for our collaboration is that high biodiversity areas in sub-Saharan Africa are focal points for sometimes quite intense international disagreements over how to conserve wildlife. And competing answers to questions such as these often suggest that there are these quite stark differences in worldviews between people who live in the high biodiversity areas in sub-Saharan Africa and those who do not. And sometimes these differences feel almost irreconcilable. And this matters because every day, local, national, and regional decision makers need to make very difficult choices that will impact wildlife in the region and also impact millions of people who live and work in the region. And many of these decisions are highly contentious, but evidence is often lacking. So our team collects that evidence about how people living in different areas think about these contentious issues, and we communicate the results to people with the ability to effect change. So we are an international group of collaborators centered around 4 extremely talented African students, Betty, Saloom, Yolanda, and David. And we work closely as a group, emphasizing collaboration between students across 3 continents. And the students learn with and from each other, forming a very dynamic cohort supported by Lovemore, me, and Amy. And now I'm the one giving this presentation, but we're fortunate enough to have the entire team except Tricia here with us today. So if you don't already know the gang, please introduce yourself, say hi, get to know them. So far, our collaboration has focused on a set of topics that appear to be especially controversial internationally, where the local and the distant perspectives might differ substantially. So we have looked into the types of human-wildlife interactions that should or should not be criminalized, and punishments for breaking those crimes, hunting, including trophy hunting, conservation law enforcement, including those approaches that some people refer to as militarized, and the most legitimate mechanisms of wildlife decision-making. And to study these issues, we combine on-the-ground fieldwork with large-scale online methods to systematically measure and compare how multiple groups think about these controversial issues. So people living in rural and urban areas of sub-Saharan Africa, and people who live in rural and urban areas of the UK and the USA. So we work in 2 trans-frontier conservation areas, one in East Africa and one in Southern Africa. And we have 5 rural project locations across 3 countries. And these places where we work, where we do the in-person field work, are biodiversity rich. They're also focal points for extreme international interest and funding. And they're land use mosaics that are home to millions of people, they're working landscapes. So we tend to categorize the different samples that we have into local and distant publics. So the local publics are those who live in the high biodiversity areas, and the distant publics are the people who live away from those high biodiversity areas. And for this purpose, we consider people living in the urban areas of sub-Saharan Africa to be a distant public. And we've collected data from more than 3,800 people, including more than 2,200 people whose perspectives are seldom heard in some of these controversial decisions or contested decisions, but who are directly affected by those decisions. And this allows us to use quantitative comparisons to generate new knowledge on international perceptions of these issues that can be very polarizing. Excuse me. So we also consider the communities and the people who live in our study community, in our study locations, to be partners in this research. So at the beginning of the project, we visited the communities. We asked for permission to do this research and to understand the challenges that the people living in these areas experience with conservation. And an important part of our research, and we were fortunate enough to have funding to do this extra step, was to return to the communities where we collected data before preparing any publications. So after an initial data analysis, we returned to the communities to present and discuss our initial findings. And we asked the communities to help us understand why we might have received these responses from people living in the communities. So this allowed us to get the stories behind the numbers, if you like. And this step allowed us to, well, it made our science better and more accurate. And it also helped to ensure that we could sensitively and accurately reflect the community perspectives in our scientific and non-scientific outputs. Excuse me. So I'm going to summarize some findings from one research topic, and that was conservation law enforcement. And this is very divisive and very emotive, and that was illustrated and encapsulated in the film that we watched in this room last night. And this topic was especially sensitive in the communities where we work. And it was perhaps especially polarizing relating to activities associated with militarized conservation, which is often defined as using military-style techniques, tactics, practices, equipment, personnel to protect biodiversity in conservation spaces. So across 2 studies, we asked people about how acceptable or unacceptable they perceive a variety of law enforcement activities, things rangers do. So we looked at rangers stopping and searching people, arresting people, monitoring people's movements, carrying guns, and in a separate study we looked specifically at when rangers might shoot at people they suspect of breaking conservation laws. So we found that perspectives on these activities were not monolithic. In fact, acceptability of these different ranger activities depends on what rangers do, where they do them, and why they do them. So generally, rangers' activities that occurred inside the protected or conserved area were seen as more acceptable than outside the PCA. And that finding was consistent across all publics, the local publics and the distant publics. And that's maybe not very surprising because people tend to see the PCAs as ranger territory and they're allowed to operate inside there more than outside, but it complicates law enforcement activities because sometimes rangers need to operate outside the PCAs. And the relative acceptability of these 4 activities depended on whether they would occur inside or outside the PCA. So those activities that were seen as more acceptable inside the PCA were not always those that were more acceptable outside the PCA. And you can see that because across all the combinations, the examples we looked at, the most acceptable activity overall was when rangers monitor people's movements inside the PCA, and the least acceptable activity was when rangers arrest people outside the PCA. And we as a team were surprised that maybe carrying guns wasn't the least acceptable one. But this makes a bit more sense when we understand that ranger activities were more acceptable when they would protect people from wild animals and when they would help reduce poaching. And this finding, I think, suggests that people see protecting people and reducing poaching as core responsibilities, things that rangers are expected to do. So of all the aspects of conservation law enforcement that we looked at, by far the most sensitive one was when rangers might shoot at suspected criminals. And maybe unsurprisingly, shooting at people was not very acceptable. Acceptability was low across all publics, the local publics and the distant publics. However, it did depend strongly on which crime rangers would suspect those people of committing inside the PCA. So this kind of makes sense because it reflects this general recognition, and this is what the community has told us, that rangers have a right to defend themselves. And most often, poachers will be armed, so rangers have a right to be armed too. So overall, we found that ranger activities, all these activities, were more acceptable to the distant publics than the local publics. And the exception was in Magadi in southern Kenya, where perspectives there looked more like the distant perspectives than the other local perspectives. And maybe this is because the PCA there is a community-led PCA, where the rangers are community scouts, they're from the area, they speak the language, they are trusted, and they are not typically armed. So, across these 2 studies, we found no outright endorsement or rejection of militarized aspects of conservation. It's much more complicated than that. And we were surprised that acceptability for some aspects was so high, especially when people live in near the strict PCAs. And we found some evidence of a global north, global south divide, but a more complex local distant divide in perspectives seems to be emerging from our data. And that more complex local distance divide maps onto another study that we published earlier this year. So we wanted to know how people in all these 10 publics think about two enduring ideological divisions in international conservation. Should conservation prioritize the interest of people or the interest of wild animals? And should it prioritize the interest of individual animals or groups of animals? And what we found was, again, that the major dividing lines seemed to be the people who live in the high biodiversity areas versus the people who live further away. And we think that these differences in priorities or values or worldviews might explain why conservation programs and policies that seem more acceptable to donors, funding agencies, researchers, etc., from outside of the high biodiversity areas might be less acceptable locally, including conservation law enforcement, but also things like hunting, culling, and translocations. So I hope that gives you a glimpse of who we are, what we do, why we do it. And we're looking forward to continuing this research in this period between now and 2030, where many more contested issues are surely going to have to be looked into to make sure that the decisions that are made on where the international community goes reflect the diverse voices. So I'll leave you with this diagram, and Betty Rono in our team likes to think of our collaboration as a tree. And that's a tree with roots in collaboration, communities, and evidence, yielding fruits in the form of scientific and non-scientific outputs, and continuing to grow and produce fruits into the future. So with grateful thanks to our funders, this research would not be possible without you. And also special thanks to all the people who helped along the way. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to allow for one quick question, if that's okay. Anyone? Right at the back. Thank you.
Thank you for the very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Unsurprisingly, it came out that a lot of people want to prioritize wild animals over people. What do you think needs to happen to shift that mindset? Because it doesn't work. We tried that already.
So I think you ask a question that's at the heart of all this. We can document these moral divisions as researchers. I think that's our job. Right? We can provide the evidence about the contours of these divisions. Changing stuff, I'm not sure that's researchers' job, right? That's the people who've got the mandates to make decisions, or maybe it's the job of the advocacy organizations. But I think that in order to manage these moral divisions, you first of all need to understand them, and that's where we've got. This is maybe just a long-winded way of dodging your question, because it's a very good question and a very difficult one.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you to all the presenters. You've let us take a lot of food for thought with us as we digest our lunch, which apparently is served under the trees. Thank you.